Hello and welcome to This Date in History, aka TDH. This show is all about the events that occurred today in years past, both recognized by actual historians, but mainly things I personally find intriguing enough for me to bring to you. The source of this information comes from the smart device application Today in History on this day. For links to the app, music, and anything else potentially interesting, check the box below. Anyway, on with the show! Today is Freya's Day, aka Friday, December 17th, 2021. In 497 BC, which means before Christ, Saturnalia, a festival and holiday in honor of the god Saturn, was celebrated for the first time, taking place in ancient Rome. In 920, Romanos I Lecapenus was crowned co-emperor of the underage Constantine VII. Lecapenus would later be deposed in December of 944. Moving on up around 500 years in 1538, King Henry VIII of England, having already been warned after his request to divorce his wife, was excommunicated by Pope Paul III. This led to the creation of the Church of England. In 1777, the United States of America was formally recognized as a country by France, taking place during the Revolution, and without them there would not be an America and by extension Australia. A few years later in 1790, the Aztec calendar stone was discovered at El Zocalo, Mexico City. Jumping up into the 1800s, in 1807, the Milan Decree, an enforcement of the 1806 Berlin Decree, was issued by France, not only confirming the Continental Army, but also allowed economic warfare against the United Kingdom by banning the rest of Europe to conduct trade with the island nation. About 30 years later, in 1835, 13 acres of New York City's financial district were destroyed during the Second Great Fire of New York. In 1862, General Order No. 11, issued by General Ulysses S. Grant during the American Civil War, expelled Jews from parts of Tennessee, Mississippi, and Kentucky. Now, before you start hating on Grant, he did this because it was discovered a black market for Southern cotton within the Union Army was being masterminded by God's chosen people.
It's a pretty known fact that the Jews are God's chosen people, that the Jewish homeland is Israel, that the Jews believe in the Old Testament, and that the Old Testament is about Jews. However, almost none of these facts are true. Nowhere in the Bible does it call the Jews God's chosen people. Modern-day Israel isn't really the homeland of the Jews. The Jews don't really believe in the Old Testament, and only maybe 5% of the people in the Old Testament can even be considered Jewish.
3 years later, in 1865, Franz Schubert's Unfinished Symphony was performed for the first time. In 1896, the first multi-purpose arena with the technology to create an artificial ice surface in North America, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania's Schenley Park Casino, was destroyed by a fire. Jumping into the next century, in 1903, the Wright brothers with their Wright Flyer became the first press-covered example of controlled, powered, and heavier-than-air flight.
At the dawn of the 20th century, manned flight was finally realized.
Hey Wilbur, let's do this right. We're gonna be the grandmasters of flight.
Oh yeah!
Got the power, free access control. Yaw, pitch and roll. We built a biplane, called it the Flyer. Launched off a catapult and got much higher. Planes were our invention, loud and clear. So quit whining about our landing gear.
Yeah. There is still argument as to whether the Wright brothers did make the first plane because they used a catapult, not wheels, to take off. Nevertheless, their revolutionary steering mechanism changed everything.
At Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. 3 years later, in 1907, Eugene Wangchuck was crowned the first king of Bhutan and would rule until 1926. 11 years later, in 1918, the Darwin Rebellion, a culmination of unrest in the Australian Workers' Union which had existed since 1911, saw up to 1,000 demonstrators march on Government House in Darwin, Northern Territory, Australia. 1 year later, in 1919, Uruguay became a signatory of the Buenos Aires Copyright Treaty. In 1926, a coup d'etat in Lithuania was successful, seeing Antanas Smetona as the new head of power. 365 days after that, in 1927, 2 days before schedule, Indian revolutionary Rajendra Lahiri was hanged in Gonda Jail, Uttar Pradesh, India. In 1933, the first NFL championship game was played, taking place at Chicago's Wrigley Field, seeing the Chicago Bears defeat the New York Giants 23-21. 2 years later, in 1935, the Douglas DC-3 flew for the first time, and it would live on to be a major part of history, especially due to its involvement in World War II. 3 years later, in 1938, discovering the nuclear fission of the heavy element uranium, Otto Hahn cracked the code for the scientific and technological basis of nuclear energy. In 1946, in what is today Iraq, the flag of Kurdistan was raised for the first time in Mahabad in eastern Kurdistan. 1 year later, in 1947, the Boeing B-47 Stratojet strategic bomber flew for the first time, but would not be introduced until June of 1951. 1 year after that, in 1948, in order to remove communist leadership from its predecessor, the state police, the Finnish security police was established. In 1950, the F-86 Sabre saw its first mission over Korea, having already taken to the skies back on October 1st of 1947. In 1957, becoming the first operational intercontinental ballistic missile developed by the United States, the SM-65 Atlas saw its first successful launch, being conducted at Cape Canaveral, Florida. In 1961, the city of Niterói, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, saw the deaths of over 500 people when a fire broke out during a performance by the Grand Circus Norte Americano. 6 years later, in 1967, the then Prime Minister of Australia, Harold Holt, went missing and is presumed drowned after he went swimming near Portsea, Victoria, and was never seen or heard from again. 2 years later, in 1969, having started in March of 1952, the United States Air Force Project Blue Book was closed, bringing an end to their study of UFOs. The next year, in 1970, during the Polish protests, soldiers opened fire at workers arriving by train in Giendia, murdering dozens. In 1981, in Verona, Italy, United States Brigadier General James L. Dozier was abducted by the Red Brigades. Jumping up into the millennium in 2003, piloted by Brian Binney, Spaceship One made its first powered and first supersonic flight. 2 years later, in 2005, anti-World Trade Organization protesters riot in Wan Chai, Hong Kong. In 2009, sinking off the coast of Lebanon, the MV Danny F-2 caused the deaths of 44 people and over 28,000 animals. And in 2014, having severed ties in 1961, the United States and Cuba re-established diplomatic relations. Burse, Burt Baskin, 1913, Kenneth E. Iverson, 1920, Kerry Packer, 1937, Ryan Johnson, 1973, Manny Pacquiao, 1978. Des, Kaspar Hauser, 1833, the 13th Dalai Lama, 1933, Kim Jong-il, 2011. And that concludes the show! Once again, check the underbar for any links you may be interested in. For your dose of past events daily, I am Aoxander, and you are you. Toodles!